The distant thunder of hooves against packed earth was the only warning Zara Calloway had before the mob appeared on the horizon, torches blazing against the darkening Montana sky of 1878. Her hands trembled as she dropped the curtain back into place and reached for the shotgun propped beside her door, a gift from her father that she had never imagined using. 3 months in Whiteridge, and already they wanted her gone. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the approaching riders through a crack in the curtains. 13 men, all from town, led by Maxwell Thornton, the saloon owner whose son had died under mysterious circumstances last spring. They blamed her, the new schoolteacher who had arrived just weeks after the tragedy. The woman who wouldn't speak. "Come out, Miss Calloway," Thornton's voice boomed across her small yard. "Town's decided we don't want your kind here no more." Zara pressed herself against the wall beside the window, clutching the shotgun. She couldn't speak to defend herself even if she wanted to. Not since that terrible night 3 years ago when the stagecoach had been ambushed, her parents murdered before her eyes, and the trauma had stolen her voice. The doctor in Boston had called it hysterical mutism, a condition that might resolve with time or might remain forever. But Whiteridge didn't care about medical explanations. They cared that she was strange, different, suspicious. That children sometimes came home from her schoolhouse with odd ideas, that she communicated through writing and gestures instead of proper speech like God intended. "We know you're in there," another voice called. "Got till morning to clear out or we'll make you." A rock shattered through her front window, glass spraying across the wooden floor. Zara bit back a silent cry, tears streaking down her face. She'd come west for a fresh start, for open spaces and simpler living. Now she'd have to run again. The sound of a single horse approaching from the opposite direction caught her attention. Through the broken window, she could make out a tall figure on horseback, riding hard toward her cabin. What in tarnation is going on here? The newcomer's voice cut through the night air like a whip crack. Thornton turned his horse. "Stay out of this, Vaughn. This ain't your concern." Zara peered more carefully through the window. Vaughn Westerly, the rancher whose property bordered the north edge of town. She'd seen him occasionally at church, sitting alone in the back pew, leaving before the final hymn. A man of few words himself, though by choice rather than circumstance. 13 men threatening a woman alone. Westerly dismounted with fluid grace, his tall frame unfolding as he stepped between the mob and her cabin. "I'd say that makes it my concern." "She's unnatural," someone called from the back. "Won't speak a word, hiding something she is." "So she's quiet," Westerly replied, his voice level but carrying easily in the night air. "Some might consider that a virtue." Thornton spat on the ground. "Town's made its decision. She goes." "Town council met just yesterday. I was there," Westerly said. "Don't recall any vote about running off the schoolteacher. This ain't official business, it's about protecting our children." Westerly's hand rested casually near his holster. "From what? A woman who teaches them their letters and numbers. From her influence, from her strangeness." Thornton was becoming agitated. "My boy was fine before she came to town. Your boy died before she even set foot in Whiteridge, Max. You know that." A heavy silence fell. Zara held her breath. "We don't want her kind here," Thornton finally muttered, "her kind." Westerly's voice had gone dangerously soft. "Educated women who want to build something in the West. Seems to me that's exactly what this territory needs." He looked around at the assembled men, many of whom were now shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. "I suggest you all head home to your families. Miss Calloway stays. Her quiet is my peace." The strange declaration hung in the air. Several men looked away, unable to meet Westerly's steady gaze. "You willing to stake your reputation on a mute woman you barely know?" Thornton challenged. "I am." Westerly didn't hesitate. "And I'll remind you that I supply beef to most of your establishments and employ half your brothers and sons. So unless you're prepared for a very long, very difficult winter, I suggest you reconsider your position." Thornton's face contorted with rage, but after a long moment he yanked his horse around. "This isn't over," he snarled before spurring his mount and galloping away. The others followed, some with backward glances, until only Westerly remained, standing sentinel in the dusty yard. When the last rider disappeared into the darkness, he approached the cabin cautiously. "Miss Calloway, are you hurt?" Zara hesitated, then set down the shotgun and moved to the door. She opened it just enough to show her face, feeling vulnerable in her nightdress with only a shawl hastily wrapped around her shoulders. Westerly removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. His face was weathered but handsome, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of a summer storm. "They broke your window," he observed. "I'd like to help you board it up for the night if you'll permit me." Zara hesitated, then nodded, opening the door wider. "I'm Vaughn Westerly," he said, though she already knew. "My ranch is north of town." She nodded again, then raised her hand in a gesture meaning she'd be right back. She disappeared into the small bedroom and returned with a slate and chalk. "Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Westerly," she wrote in a neat, flowing script. He read it without comment. "Do you have any boards we could use for the window, behind the cabin?" "Tools in the chest by the fireplace," she wrote quickly. As they worked together to cover the broken window, Zara kept stealing glances at her unexpected champion. He moved with purpose and precision, hammering boards into place with practiced ease. His silence was comfortable, not expectant like most people who waited impatiently for her to find a way to communicate. "That should hold until I can bring glass from town," he finally said, surveying their work. "Why did you help me?" she wrote on the slate. Westerly considered her question for a long moment. "I don't abide bullies," he said simply. "And I meant what I said. There's nothing wrong with being quiet." She tilted her head, studying him with skeptical eyes. "I lost my wife and daughter to influenza 5 years ago," he said, surprising her with his sudden openness. "Since then, I've found more comfort in silence than in needless chatter." He replaced his hat. "I'll come by tomorrow with proper glass for your window and Miss Calloway." She raised her eyebrows in question. Might be wise to accept Sheriff Miller's invitation to Sunday dinner this week. Being seen with respectable townsfolk will help quell some of the rumors. She quickly wrote, "The sheriff hasn't invited me anywhere." A smile briefly touched Westerly's lips. "He will. Good night, Miss Calloway." Zara watched from the doorway as he mounted his horse and rode into the darkness. She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart still racing, though whether from fear or something else entirely, she couldn't say. True to Vaughn Westerly's prediction, Sheriff Miller appeared at the schoolhouse the next afternoon, hat in hand, with an invitation to Sunday dinner with his family. Zara accepted with a nod and a written note of thanks. The sheriff seemed relieved, confessing that Westerly had suggested the arrangement. "Good man, Westerly," Miller said. "Keeps to himself mostly, but fair and honest in his dealings." Sunday dinner with the Millers was pleasant if somewhat awkward. Mrs. Miller, a plump, cheerful woman, did most of the talking, while their 2 young daughters watched Zara with undisguised fascination as she communicated through notes and gestures. "You write all your words down at school too, Miss Calloway?" 8-year-old Betsy asked. "Betsy." "That's rude," her mother scolded. Zara shook her head and smiled, writing, "I use the chalkboard and hand signals the children have learned." "Like this." Betsy demonstrated the signal Zara used for attention, and Zara nodded approvingly. "She's a fine teacher," Sheriff Miller said firmly. The children's reading scores have improved considerably since she arrived. As Zara was preparing to leave, the sheriff pulled her aside. "Westerly's bringing a herd to the stockyards tomorrow. Says he has that glass for your window. Thought you might want to know." She nodded her thanks, ignoring the knowing look in Mrs. Miller's eyes. The next day after school, Zara made her way to the stockyards at the edge of town. She spotted Vaughn immediately, his tall figure distinct among the cowboys as he negotiated with the yard master. She waited at a respectful distance until their business concluded. When he approached her, Zara was struck again by his height and the quiet intensity in his storm-gray eyes. "Miss Calloway," he greeted her with a slight tip of his hat. "I've got that glass in my wagon. Would you like me to bring it by this evening?" She nodded, then hesitated before writing on her small pocket slate. "I'd like to thank you properly. Could I offer you supper?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he schooled his expression. "That's kind but unnecessary." She frowned and wrote again, "I insist, I'm a good cook." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "In that case, I accept." That evening, Zara prepared a simple but hearty meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and apple pie. She took extra care with her appearance, pinning her chestnut hair in a softer style than her usual severe schoolteacher bun. Vaughn arrived promptly at 6, wagon loaded with the promised window glass. They worked together to install it, and Zara marveled at how effortlessly they communicated despite her silence. He seemed to anticipate her needs, handing her tools before she reached for them, understanding her gestures without the slate. Over dinner, she learned more about him through carefully written questions. His ranch, the Double W, had been established 12 years ago when he'd come west from Pennsylvania with his young wife. They'd built it from nothing into one of the most successful operations in the territory before influenza had taken both his wife Elizabeth and their 4-year-old daughter Susan. "It was quick, at least," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Not that it made it easier." Zara wrote, "I understand loss," then hesitated before adding, "Stagecoach robbery 1875. Parents killed, I watched, haven't spoken since." He read her words without comment, but his eyes softened with understanding. "Some wounds don't need explaining," he said simply. After that evening, Vaughn began appearing regularly in town on days when school let out. Sometimes he would walk Zara home, carrying her books. Other times he would bring small gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry, once a beautifully carved wooden box for her chalk and slates. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Some, like the Millers, seemed pleased. Others, including Maxwell Thornton and his followers, watched with suspicious eyes. "Don't understand what Westerly sees in that mute woman," Thornton was overheard saying at the saloon. Something unnatural about the whole arrangement. But as autumn deepened toward winter, more of the town began to accept Zara's presence. Parents noticed their children's improved reading and arithmetic. Her students adored her, quickly learning her system of hand signals and defending her fiercely against any criticism. Thornton, however, remained unconvinced. His grief over his son's death had curdled into a bitter obsession that Zara somehow bore responsibility, despite having arrived weeks after the tragedy. One crisp November afternoon, as Zara was walking home from school, Thornton stepped out from between two buildings, blocking her path. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath heavy with whiskey. "Think you've won, don't you?" he slurred. "Got everyone fooled, even Westerly." Zara tried to step around him, but he moved to block her. "My boy could write too, you know, good with his letters." His voice broke. "Found his journal after he died, full of strange ideas about spirits and old Indian beliefs, just like the nonsense you've been filling their heads with." She shook her head vehemently, trying to indicate she had nothing to do with his son's ideas. "Don't lie to me," Thornton's voice rose. "Someone was teaching him, and now you're here, filling the other children's heads with the same garbage." He grabbed her arm, fingers digging painfully into her flesh. Zara's slate and books clattered to the ground. "You think I don't see? You can't talk because you made some devil's bargain." "You took my boy's soul?" Zara struggled against his grip, panic rising in her chest. A few passers-by had stopped, watching uncertainly. "Let her go, Max." Vaughn's voice cut through the commotion as he appeared from the direction of the general store, his expression dangerously calm. "Stay out of this, Westerly. This is between me and her." "I won't tell you again." Vaughn stepped closer. "Release her. Now." Something in his tone must have penetrated Thornton's drunken haze because he abruptly let go of Zara's arm. She stumbled backward, rubbing the painful spot where his fingers had dug in. Your boy was interested in Native beliefs months before Miss Calloway ever set foot in this territory, Vaughn said evenly. He used to ride out to the reservation and talk to the elders. Everyone knew it. Thornton's face contorted. That's a lie. Ask anyone who worked at the livery. Ask Sheriff Miller. Your son was a curious boy with an open mind. Vaughn's voice softened slightly. That's to your credit, Max, not something to be ashamed of. Tears welled in Thornton's bloodshot eyes. He wasn't right at the end, talking nonsense about spirits and visions. He had fever for days before he died. Fever makes people delirious. Vaughn placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder. It wasn't Miss Calloway, it wasn't spirits, it was just illness, Max. The same kind that took my Elizabeth and Susan. Thornton sagged suddenly, as if all the fight had drained out of him. I miss him, he whispered. Every day I miss my boy. I know, Vaughn said quietly. Believe me, I know. The sheriff appeared then, summoned by one of the onlookers. He gently led Thornton away, promising to see him home safely. Vaughn turned to Zara, concern evident in his eyes. Are you hurt? She shook her head, though her arm throbbed where Thornton had grabbed her. Vaughn bent to retrieve her fallen books and slate. May I walk you home? He asked. She nodded gratefully, too shaken to do more. They walked in silence until they reached her cabin. At the door, Zara hesitated, then wrote, Thank you again. You don't need to thank me, she wrote quickly. Why do you keep defending me? Vaughn looked away for a moment, his profile sharp against the setting sun. At first, it was simple decency. No one should be harassed for being different. He turned back to meet her gaze. But now it's because I care what happens to you, Zara. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made her heart flutter strangely. Would you consider having dinner at my ranch this Saturday? He asked. I'd like to show you the place. Zara's eyes widened in surprise. Such an invitation carried implications in a small town like Whiteridge. She studied his face, searching for his intentions. Just dinner, he assured her, correctly reading her hesitation, and perhaps a tour of the property, nothing improper. After a moment, she nodded and wrote, I would like that very much. Saturday dawned clear and cold. Zara spent more time than usual on her appearance, finally selecting her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color in her eyes. She pinned her hair in a style she hadn't worn since before the attack, loose waves falling over one shoulder, secured with her mother's silver combs. Vaughn arrived precisely at noon, driving a polished buggy rather than his usual wagon. He seemed momentarily stunned when she opened the door. You look beautiful, he said simply. The Double W Ranch was impressive, a sprawling main house built of solid timber. Barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and outbuildings spread across a valley with mountains rising in the distance. Cattle grazed on the hillsides and horses nickered in the paddocks as they drove past. Started with 40 acres and 20 head of cattle, Vaughn explained. Now it's 4,000 acres and over 2,000 head. Inside, the house was surprisingly warm and inviting. Masculine in its furnishings, but with unexpected touches, shelves of books, landscapes on the walls, a piano in the corner of the sitting room. Elizabeth played, he said, noticing Zara's interest in the instrument. I keep it tuned, though no one uses it now. He gave her a tour of the ground floor, then excused himself to check on dinner preparations. Left alone in the sitting room, Zara examined the photographs on the mantel. Vaughn younger and smiling beside a pretty blonde woman holding a toddler with curls. My cook insisted on preparing everything herself, Vaughn said, returning. She doesn't often get to cook for guests, especially not ladies. Dinner was elaborate and delicious: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from the ranch's greenhouse. Afterward, they sat before the fire in the sitting room, Zara with a slate to converse. May I ask you something personal? Vaughn said after a comfortable silence. She nodded, though apprehension flickered in her chest. The doctors in Boston, did they believe your voice might return someday? Zara hesitated, then wrote, They said it might with time and the right circumstances, or it might not. The mind protects itself in strange ways. Do you remember how to speak? The mechanics of it, I mean. She considered this, then wrote, Sometimes I form words in my mind. Sometimes I even feel my throat wanting to make sounds, but when I try. She paused, then added, Fear takes over. Vaughn nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for telling me. Does it bother you? She wrote. My silence? No, he replied without hesitation. Your silence isn't emptiness, Zara. You communicate more clearly than most people I know who never stop talking. A comfortable silence fell between them. The fire crackled in the grate, and outside, snow had begun to fall gently. It's getting late, Vaughn finally said. The storm's picking up. I should get you home before the roads become difficult. The ride back to town was quiet, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. When they reached her cabin, Vaughn insisted on lighting her lamps and stoking her fire before he left. At the door, he paused. Would you permit me to call on you again? Zara nodded, warmth blooming in her chest. Good, he said softly. That's good. Throughout December, Vaughn called on Zara regularly. They developed routines: Sunday walks after church, Wednesday dinners at her cabin, occasional visits to the ranch when weather permitted. They communicated through her slate, through gestures, and increasingly, through a silent understanding that needed no words at all. Christmas approached, bringing festive preparations to Whiteridge. The school was to host a pageant, and Zara threw herself into organizing it, determined that her students would shine. The night of the pageant, the schoolhouse was packed with parents and townsfolk. Zara directed from the side, using her hand signals to cue the children, who performed their parts flawlessly. Even Maxwell Thornton attended, sober and subdued, watching the proceedings with sad eyes but no hostility. Afterward, as parents collected their children and congratulated Zara, Vaughn appeared at her side, something concealed behind his back. That was wonderful, he said. You've done amazing things with these children. She smiled, pleased by his praise. I have something for you. He brought forward a small wooden box exquisitely carved with wildflowers. An early Christmas gift. Zara opened it carefully. Inside, nestled on velvet, lay a silver locket on a delicate chain. She looked up at him questioningly. Open it, he encouraged. Inside the locket was a tiny, perfect sketch of a meadowlark in flight. You remind me of them, Vaughn explained softly. They're quiet until they have something important to express. Then their song is the most beautiful on the prairie. Tears welled in Zara's eyes. She gestured for him to help her put it on, turning so he could fasten the clasp at the nape of her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, sending shivers down her spine. When she turned back, their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a recognition of feelings that had been building for months. Miss Calloway. One of her students tugged at her skirt, breaking the moment. Ma says to thank you for the pageant and Merry Christmas. The spell broken, Zara smiled down at the child, touching the locket at her throat with wondering fingers. Christmas Day brought a blizzard that kept most of Whiteridge homebound. Zara spent the morning alone in her cabin, reading by the fire and thinking of Christmases past with her family. A knock at her door in the early afternoon startled her. Vaughn stood on her porch, snow coating his hat and shoulders, leading a horse laden with packages. Merry Christmas, he said, stamping snow from his boots. I know it's improper to call without invitation, especially today, but I couldn't bear the thought of you spending the holiday alone. He had brought a feast: roast goose, potatoes, pies, and all the trimmings prepared by his cook. Together they set the table and shared the meal, the storm raging outside while warmth and companionship filled the small cabin. After dinner, Zara presented Vaughn with her gift, a hand-knitted scarf in deep gray wool that matched his eyes, and a book of Tennyson's poetry she had ordered specially from Denver. How did you know Tennyson was my favorite? He asked, surprised. She smiled and wrote, You quoted Ulysses when we discussed the mountains last month. His expression softened. You notice everything, don't you? She shrugged, then wrote, It's easier to observe when you're not expected to speak. Later, as Vaughn prepared to brave the storm for his ride home, he paused at the door. Zara, he said, her name like a caress on his lips. "These past months have been the happiest I've known since I lost my family. I never expected to feel this way again." She held her breath, her heart pounding. "I'm not a man who speaks easily of feelings," he continued, "but I want you to know that I love you, your silence, your strength, your gentleness, all of you." He met her gaze steadily. "You don't need to respond now. Take all the time you need." Zara's hands trembled as she wrote on her slate, "I love you too." Vaughn read her words, his expression transforming with joy. Gently, he took the slate from her hands and set it aside. Then, with infinite tenderness, he cupped her face and lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was soft at first, then deepened with shared longing. When they finally parted, Zara felt as though something long frozen inside her had begun to thaw. "I should go," Vaughn whispered, though he made no move toward the door. Zara shook her head, then gestured to the window where snow was piling against the glass. "It would be dangerous to travel now," he acknowledged. But propriety, she touched his lips with her fingers, then wrote, "Stay, I trust you," he nodded, understanding her meaning. "I'll sleep by the fire." That night, as the blizzard howled around the cabin, Zara lay in her bed listening to Vaughn's steady breathing from the other room. For the first time in 3 years, she felt completely safe. Spring came early to Montana in 1879. As the snow melted and wildflowers began dotting the prairie, Vaughn proposed properly. With a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a simple gold band set with a single perfect pearl. They were married in April, with most of Whiteridge in attendance. Sheriff Miller gave the bride away, and his daughters served as flower girls. Even Maxwell Thornton came sober, and recently returned from a trip to Denver where he'd sought help for his drinking and grief. After the ceremony, as guests gathered at the hotel for the celebration, Thornton approached the couple. "Miss Calloway, Mrs. Westerly now, I suppose," he said awkwardly. "I owe you an apology. My behavior was inexcusable." Zara looked at him with compassion and nodded her acceptance. "My boy's journal," Thornton continued hesitantly, "the one I mentioned. I'd like you to see it sometime. He was a bright lad, interested in everything, would have loved your teaching style, I think." Zara wrote on her small slate, "I would be honored." Thornton nodded stiffly, then offered his hand to Vaughn. "You're a lucky man, Westerly." "I know it," Vaughn replied, taking the offered hand. That night, in the privacy of the master bedroom at the W, now their shared home, Vaughn held Zara close. "Happy?" he asked softly. She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. "Your quiet is my peace," he whispered, repeating the words that had first drawn them together. "And your love is my salvation." 1 year later, as spring again transformed the Montana landscape, Zara sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching Vaughn work with a young colt in the corral. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling their child move beneath her palm. The sound of an approaching wagon drew her attention. Sheriff Miller's wife climbed down, waving cheerfully as she approached with a basket. "Thought you might like some of those preserves you enjoyed last time," Mrs. Miller called, "and to check how you're feeling with the little one due so soon." Zara smiled and gestured for the woman to join her on the porch. As Mrs. Miller settled into the adjacent rocking chair, she launched into town gossip, requiring little response beyond Zara's nods and smiles. "And the school board is just beside themselves trying to find a replacement half as good as you for next term," Mrs. Miller continued. "Though everyone understands you'll have your hands full with motherhood." Vaughn had finished with the colt and was walking toward the house, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hat tipped back on his head. "Afternoon, Mrs. Miller," he called. "What brings you out our way?" "Just bringing some preserves and checking on your lovely wife," she replied. "We were just discussing the school board's troubles finding a teacher for fall term." Vaughn glanced at Zara, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. "Actually," he said, "Zara's been considering taking on a few advanced students here at the ranch once the baby is a bit older. Not a full school, mind you, but perhaps special tutoring for those preparing for college examinations." "Oh, that would be wonderful," Mrs. Miller exclaimed. Young Thomas Henderson is hoping to attend university in Denver, and his parents have been worried about his preparation. As Mrs. Miller continued talking excitedly about potential students, Vaughn came to stand behind Zara's chair, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She reached up to cover it with her own, their fingers intertwining. The baby kicked forcefully, and Zara gasped softly. "Active little one, isn't it?" Mrs. Miller observed with a knowing smile. Zara nodded, then cleared her throat. Both Vaughn and Mrs. Miller looked at her in surprise. "Yes," Zara whispered, her voice rusty from disuse but audible. "Very active." Mrs. Miller's eyes widened in shock. Vaughn's hand tightened on Zara's shoulder. "Well," Mrs. Miller finally managed, that's wonderful." When she had gone, promises to keep Zara's secret until she was ready extracted, Vaughn knelt before his wife's chair. "You spoke," he said, wonder in his voice. "I've been practicing," Zara admitted, her words halting but clear. "When you're out with the herd, it's still difficult, but I wanted our child to hear my voice." Tears filled Vaughn's eyes. "I fell in love with you in your silence. Your voice is just another gift I never expected." "I found my voice because of you," she whispered. "Because you valued my silence instead of fearing it. Because you gave me peace when they would have driven me away." He kissed her then, tenderly, reverently, his hand resting over hers on her belly where their child grew strong. That evening, as twilight painted the Montana sky in shades of purple and gold, Vaughn sat on the porch with his arm around his wife, watching the first stars appear. "What shall we name the baby?" he asked. Zara considered for a moment. "If it's a girl, I'd like to honor your Elizabeth somehow." "And if it's a boy, Thomas," she said softly. "It means twin, because he'll have both our strength." Vaughn nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Their child would inherit his father's quiet confidence, and his mother's resilient spirit, the silence that had protected her, and the voice she had reclaimed. "Thomas or Elizabeth Westerly," he murmured. "Either way, the luckiest child in Montana territory." As darkness settled over the Double W Ranch, Zara leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, at peace in the quiet they shared. The woman they had tried to drive out for her silence had found not only her voice, but also a love that transcended words, a future built on understanding that ran deeper than speech ever could.